we're ready to roll.
Welcome to the City of Riverside's council meeting work session on November the 9th. I'd ask everyone if you would call the roll, please.
Mr. Denny,
Here.
Mrs. Franklin,
Here.
Ms. Fry,
Here.
Mr. Joseph,
Yes.
Ms. Lomach,
Yes.
Mr. Maxfield,
Present.
Mayor Williams.
Move to excuse.
Is there a motion to
Second.
excuse the mayor?
I motion, Jesse seconded.
Motion by Zach, second by Jesse. All those in favor? Those opposed? Thank you. If you would all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda, sir?
No, Deputy Mayor. Move to approve. Second.
Motion's made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion to approve the agenda.
Yep.
Yep.
Just to
We're
just
good.
did. Okay, work session items. Turn it over to the city manager, Mr. Roush.
Thank you, ma'am, and thanks everybody for being here this evening. We only have one item to discuss, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. But I did want to sort of try to set the table for what I think will be an initial conversation about the budget. And talking with Kim, I think we are at a point where, or Ms. Baker, I should say, we're at a point where we have I think a firm grasp of the personnel and the operating numbers. We would like to go back through some of the weeds early next week and just make sure we have a firm grasp on some of the capital and some of the debt numbers. So what I'll be showing you tonight is sort of where we've landed to date and some of the assumptions that we've made to date with respect to what the operating and personnel pieces of this look like. All right, so bear with me. I do have a short little presentation. Well, short, he says, in air quotes, presentation. Let me share this with the.
I was just gonna ask, share.
There we go. And I think I can hide that as well. All right. So I kind of thought I would take a bit of a step back just to, again, kind of set the tone. So when you go into the Maxwell School at Syracuse for public administration, they have this engraved in marble over the top of the entryway, to the school. If you go back in our break room, I've written it on the wall back there. This is a copy of the Athenian Oath. A lot of communities across the country, if you go and look at mission, vision, value statements, most of those kinds of things echo what's written here. In a nutshell, really, I think the intent of this really is summed up in the last sentence, and particularly in the last portion there that's bolded. The idea is that we're all here working together, council from a policy perspective, staff from an operations perspective, to make the place better than we found it, right? So we are here trying to deploy our resources, or the taxpayers' resources, to achieve the strategic goals that you all have described in the strategic plan, what we've talked about in our land use plan. The budget is the tool that lets us do that. It's the document that says, here's how we're going to take what the taxpayers have given us and deploy it to achieve those ends. So I like to frame the conversation from this point, because this is the lens through which I know I personally and a lot of the staff look at and think about this conversation. Sort of where are we really starting from when we get down to the core of what it is that we're doing here. The second quote I have found to be true sort of throughout my career, which is very simple, by John Muir. It's when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And that is a quote that is particularly useful in a budget context. When we have a bunch of resources that the taxpayers have given us, and those resources are finite, meaning, we don't go out and make a ton of profit. We don't have investors that allow us to expand, the amount of capital that we have very easily, like a private business. We operate in some very firm walls when it comes to our resources. Pulling money from column A and putting it in column B has real impacts across the budget, whether that's capital, operating debt, The choices that we make in one part of the budget impact other parts of the budget. And that's true in every community all over the country, all over the world, but it's important to bear in mind, particularly through this kind of conversation. So I'll start at the end. What's the bottom line with the 2024 budget? The bottom line is that we are continuing to transition to a more effective budgeting and financial management process and to implement those systems that are going to help us continue to understand and articulate this story more effectively in the future. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit. Another bottom line, it is true, some of our revenues are up. We will talk a little bit about income tax. We're doing pretty well with respect to income tax. It is also true that our expenses are up. And we'll dive into that as well. So we've continued, I think, to have some positive growth on the revenue side. We continue to have to deal with growth on the expense side. At the end of the day, our budget really is impacted by three significant structural constraints. There are three things that really drag this budget down. The first is the buildings that we're in right now, Right Point. They require a significant subsidy from the general fund in order to keep the lights on. The second is the Public Service Department, which, as we've talked about before, and really all this year, does not have its own ordinary revenue stream, revenue source. It is entirely funded pretty much by the general fund. Those costs continue to go up. We just got out of a labor negotiation there as well. And so we know now what those costs are likely to look like, at least for personnel over the next 3 years, but they're going to increase. And similarly in public safety, I cannot give the voters enough credit and the members of this community enough credit for approving the income tax that went through a couple of years ago. If we didn't have that, we would be in a much different and much more unpleasant place today. Having said that, I think it's important, especially as we continue this process of understanding where our money comes from and where it's going. It's important to understand that public safety represents the bulk of our personnel, the bulk of our expenditures, and the income tax alone cannot pay for it. It is too expensive to provide these services, given the income tax that has come in, even though we're doing better on income tax than we've expected. And we'll get into that a little bit too. And at the end of the day, these three budget constraints really tee up what our next year is going to look like. What I'm seeing in 2024 is the need for us to have probably some fairly difficult conversations in some respects, but the need to make some pretty important decisions for our community about how we look at revenue, and again, to monitor what we're doing on the expense side, and then to start to try to make headway to fill these structural holes so that we can get out ahead of the curve and start to run and win races. All right, so a little bit about transitions, kind of the first thing that I just talked about last slide. I do want to sort of remind everyone that a year ago, we did not have the finance system we have today. We did not have the budgeting software that we have today. We didn't have, candidly, half of the senior staff that we have today. 12 months ago, this place looked a lot different. It will continue to look a lot different. We are in and will continue to move through transitions. So the first piece of that is obviously the finance software. We have the bulk of that software implemented. We still need to work on asset management, capital improvements, and utility billing. Utility billing will be the most important thing next year because we are not going to solve the public service stormwater hole unless we start tackling that project. We also completely renumbered our chart of accounts. And that's important because last year, I was able to pull, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I was able to pull a big data dump out of the old finance software and get way down deep in Excel and try to line up prior years with current year and paint really pretty pictures and charts and graphs about kind of what's been going on insofar as I could figure that out. When we changed account numbers, it skews your ability to easily look back in the past. So the advantage is that going forward in our new systems, it will be much easier
dive into that a little bit more with like what was changed, just so like you say like account numbers, but like for the rest of us, what's that mean contextually?
Yeah, the probably the best way of of talking about that is that there are two big things that changed. So every line item in the budget has its own unique number. We added some digits to that number to let us easily summarize where revenues and expenses hit the budget for based on department, but also based on like gap codes that should help us, do our finances a little bit more easily. We also relabeled and renumbered several of the objects. So the individual things like membership fees or donations, things like that. We tried to be a little more rigorous about what we were calling things and to make room to add more lines and accounts in the future. So when you have numbers and names that change, it's a little bit more difficult to go apples to apples. We've implemented ClearGov. So as I mentioned earlier at the kickoff, we've got personnel and operational budgeting pretty well buttoned down. I think the digital budget book is also well on its way. I can show off some of the work that the departments have been able to do on that. And clear plans. I know we've talked a little bit about how I've got portions of our strategic plan plugged into that. Naya has been diligently working with ClearGov on putting our land use plan into that so we can use it like a work planning tool as well. But going forward, as I mentioned, the capital budgeting piece, which I hear is the easiest module to implement, is on our radar, as well as the public transparency portal. And those are the tools over the next year, 2 years, 3 years that will let us start being more articulate and effective about forecasting, communicating where we're going and what the future looks like. The last piece I mentioned is just the significant staffing changes. So we have a new finance director, Ms. Baker, who's been doing an admirable job, a new fire chief, a new HR manager. We had some institutional knowledge leave the organization this year, which means when questions come up, it's a little bit more difficult to just pull somebody aside and say, hey, what's up with that? On the other hand, we have a whole lot of fresh eyes that are looking at where we are today, and we're continuing to engage other partners. We're getting ready to have a kickoff meeting with the Shared Resource Center, who's they're a local firm, the financial firm. They do consulting for schools and other municipalities all around us. And we're going to start a very diligent process of looking at everything we're talking about today, our financial processes, everything else, and working with them over the coming months to help us get to the best place we can be as an organization. So we continue to do that due diligence in that work. So revenues, everybody's favorite. Let's chat income tax. So this is the chart that has been a favorite of mine that we've shown periodically about every quarter. So what you're looking at here, I wish that thing would get out of the way, but the tan line is what we actually collected in 2022, again by quarter. The pale green line is what we budgeted for in 2023. Again, it's a little more art than science. We kind of cut it up based on weeks in each quarter. The dark green line is what we've actually collected so far year to date. So just in looking at this, we had a very good first and second quarter. We missed a little bit in third quarter. We're well on our way here in the fourth quarter. What that means is that we had initially budgeted about 8.6 million in revenues for income tax this year. Our actual collections are likely to come in closer to 9.8, and 9.8 is the number that we're using going forward into next year's budget. And we're using that number in part because we had a good conversation with CCA, and they suggested that based on what they're seeing, next year's revenues should look a lot like this year's revenues, unless we have a major change in employers. Somebody leaves, somebody comes in, that's obviously going to skew the income tax numbers. But by and large, 9.8 feels like a reasonable and somewhat conservative estimate as far as what our revenue picture is going to look like. So all of the numbers that we'll be talking about today as far as operations include that assumption that will bring in about $9.8 million in income tax. Now, a lot of people may be tempted to say, oh, Josh, 9.8 million, you only budgeted 8.6. That means you have $1.2 million left over. And that's not really the case. We will talk about that. But before we do, I skipped a slide. I do just want to reiterate that of that 9.8 million, we will continue to divide this the way we're obligated to, 60% to public safety, 40% to the general fund. And a quick note on that. In prior years, my understanding has been there's been a number of different approaches as far as how to allocate income taxes between the police and fire departments. We're at a point again, because regardless of which, those departments collectively require more money than the income tax generates. They need subsidies from the general fund in order to move forward. just to keep the accounting simple, we're splitting those down the middle. So that in effect, fire gets 30% of the income tax, police gets 30%. And then we will talk about kind of where the gaps are when we get into each of the individual funds. But it's consistent with what we are obligated to do. So back to my earlier point, you may think, well, okay, so we're doing better on income tax. That means we're flush with all this cash. That's not true because our expenses have also continued to increase. And one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that in the 2024 budget, we are preserving the positions that we added in public safety last year. So those positions will stay. We are also adding a couple of positions in the fire department. And I've made some reductions on the administration side in terms of trying to save some cost savings, reallocate those dollars where they're most needed. With the net impact being that we will see probably about 2 full-time employees hit the budget next year as new costs. So those are already in the numbers that we're talking about. Besides the staffing adjustments, as I mentioned earlier, we have the contractual increases that we've negotiated with CWA. I'll kind of skip ahead to my last bullet point here, which is that we have an unknown quantity of increases that are coming our way because the bulk of our employees still haven't negotiated a contract. Officers, sergeants, and the fire department, none of that has been finalized. So those will add an unknown amount of increase to the numbers that you're going to look at tonight. Aside from that, we had actually a very competitive health insurance increase, and I'll credit Mr. Lohr, who helped us get into the OBC, as well as April Davis, who's continued to manage that relationship. They've done a fantastic job for us. That percentage increase is about $62,000. But again, the asterisk there is really just to remind everybody that that number more than others is really dependent on what people want as far as the health insurance plan. So it's a bit of a fuzzy number. But the 2 other things that I really want to draw your attention to are that the state continues to impact the money that we get and the money that we spend. So, folks may look at this staffing chart and say, well, why haven't you added any police officers? And I'll tell you right now, part of the reason is because we're looking at, these are all bills that have either been introduced or are about to be introduced. We're looking at 4.5% increase in OP&F, police and fire retirement costs, to bring police up to 24%, and 4% additional in OPERS costs. And if you add those up together, that's a police officer. But if I have to pay it to Columbus, I can't hire anybody. So we continue to be impacted by forces that are outside of our control. Even though we're bringing in more money, we're being obligated to give that money away in other places. We do not operate in an island. So all that is kind of the highlights of the revenue expense picture that we're having to deal with. So what I want to do now is pivot a little bit. But before we do that, what I'll do is kind of walk you next through each of the 5 major funds. But before I do that, any questions so far on what we've talked about?
Yeah, so those on the last slide, those additional costs that we're incurring, did that affect us this year?
No, these are all coming next year.
Next year, okay.
Where are we with the Saber grants? It was a 3-year, was that
Safer grant?
Safer grants from the fire department? Because we have to take those 3 guys that we did through the grants on as full-time. Is that covered by all this?
I believe I think those grants, the last one that we were paying on, I believe fell off this year.
Okay.
So we've already accounted for the costs of the full freight that we would have to inherit. And going forward and talking with Chief Miller, he's obviously got his eye on Safer grants, and his approach will be to apply for grants that we know we can pay for after the grant assistance rolls off. So we'll definitely keep that as part of our conversation too.
Okay,
going
so the
forward.
answer is it's calculated in here already. And
Correct. Yep.
Okay, that's.
All right. So major funds, a quick note here. One of the funds, well, actually 2 quick notes. One of the funds that we talked about last year was our ARP fund, which I think the formal name is the Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. That is the money that we received most recently for COVID relief through the ARPA Act grant process. At the time, a year ago, our approach had been to take the money that we'd been allocated for that and apply it largely to capital projects on the theory that, inflation was still a thing and we would need to cover costs. After we approved that budget, we got the SS4A grant for the Woodman corridor out front, which meant we were planning on completely redoing all of Harshman Wall. Since we're basically lining up funding to redo the entire infrastructure out front, our approach had been to hold off on some of that. So we continued to spend pieces of it on infrastructure projects and to help cover inflation. I will say, incidentally, that when our projects have bid, they continue to come in well over what the engineering estimates are, anywhere from 15 to 30%, depending on the project. But the bottom line is we should go into next year with several $100,000 in unobligated ARP money. The other ARP money that is obligated is our local match for the project that we're doing with the land bank to take down 4032 Linden and some of the other blighted nuisance properties that we're working on. So we'll use that money as our local match for those projects. So the reason we're not talking ARP tonight is because I think we're going to continue that approach. We have several projects that Ms. Bartlett has teed up next year for capital infrastructure improvements, and we want to be sure that we can cover those projects. The other thing about capital is that Ms. Bartlett has done an admirable job of getting a lot of grants lined up to redo Woodman Phase 1. So that is from the new bridge up north to Eastman. We actually have about enough grant money to cover the current engineering cost of that project, which is very good news. But there is more engineering that needs to be done, is my understanding. And then that project has to bid. And that's a $6 million project. And if the bids come in 20% over, we're on the hook for whatever that overage is if we want the project to go. So one of the things that we are going to work through next week is trying to make sure that between the ARP money that we still have and between the other funds that we're not talking about tonight, are we setting aside enough to help soften the blow of any cost increase that could come our way on the capital project side? So in other words, we are not using ARP or do not intend to use ARP for any offsetting any operating costs. The second thing is that in the audit this year, and actually in the audit for the last couple of years, our auditor has pushed pretty hard for us to get rid of the capital equipment and capital improvement funds. And I won't bore you with the complexities of state law and everything else, but it basically boils down to if we set up a fund to pay off a project or like for a capital improvement, they like those funds to be dedicated to a specific project and to run for a specific amount of time. And then you get rid of the fund and you start a new one for your next project. We've been using it kind of like as a catch-all, since they've mentioned it 3 times and they keep getting a little bit more stern about it each time. We are making a conscious effort to go ahead and follow their advice. And now that we're able to track the difference between capital and operating and other personnel expenses more effectively, we're going to put it back and rearrange how those capital costs look as far as the funds go. So that's another reason why when we get into looking at the funds, we're looking primarily at operating costs. And so we'll leave the capital stuff.
So when you talk about like having a catch-all fund, now we're sparsing those capital projects. Are you talking about like each project's going to have its own fund, or are we talking like the funds that we're used to seeing might see more of an expense in those because they were allocated differently, and now we got rid of it being kind of by itself in its own fund, and now we're going to see that come into these funds?
Yeah, I don't know that I can give you a super clear answer on that at the moment. And I suspect that in some respects it will depend. It will depend in part on how we actually fund specific infrastructure projects. Like if we have, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but feel free to jump in. But if we have dedicated revenue, like an OPWC loan or something that comes in that we're going to have to make payments on, typically our practice has been to set up a separate fund for that. If it's more of a one-time, we're going to pay our local share of $100,000, we may just book it to another fund. But Ms. Baker, feel free.
Yeah, when you have specific monies come in and you can only spend it specific ways, then you have to ask the state if you can have a fund for that. And then if they approve it, then you're required to keep all that money separate. Basically, it looked like our infrastructure and capital project stuff was separate, but when they would do our financials, everything would really roll back up into the fund that we're putting it back into now. And so that's really what they were complaining about is even though you're saying it's this, it's really not. It really does belong in street. It really does belong in fire or police or wherever that asset actually belongs, unless it's a special revenue type of funding. So it really just has to do with sources and uses.
Right. So what I wanted to just bring more context into this is like, say the fire department needed a new truck. That's a big asset. And the way that that gets accounted for historically has been in the capital fund. So if we're looking at a budget and all of a sudden, like if a big purchase needs to be made in one of our main funds, you might see a major increase year over year in one of these funds because those big high ticket expenses, like think about like a car, a house, something like that in your personal life, that's all now going back into the individual funds where those expenses are coming from. So you might see a little bit of a difference in our reporting with that going away.
But and that's true. And I think the other side of it as well is that we should, again, we're building to a place where we will be much more proficient about how to do that reporting and to communicate that story in a way that's a little bit easier to grasp, I think.
Yeah, that could possibly skew the way that we've seen things in the past. I just want to make sure that
Yep.
I help provide a little bit more context.
All right. So what I will do here next is I'll take you through each one of these 5 funds. These are the 5 major operating funds that have the largest impact on our budget, kind of like we've been talking about. But I'm going to use ClearGov to do that because, as Kim will tell you, I'm obsessed with this tool. All right. So what I want to start with, let's see, this is Right Point. So I want to start, and just another caveat here. You're going to see these bar graphs for prior years because we did the account renumbering. Those are not going to be super accurate bar graphs. What I really want to draw you to, yeah, I know it flashes a lot of labels there.
Put a disclaimer, like if you separate from seniors
Yeah,
don't want that.
flashing lights. All right, but what I really want to draw your attention to is this middle chart here in yellow. We'll do these for each of the major funds, but the main idea is that the Right Point Fund now brings in about 5.8 million, or what we're budgeting for 2024. It's about 5.8 million in revenue against 5.9 million in expenditures. So, and again, not to belabor the point, but the challenge that we have with the Right Point Fund is because we've taken out notes to roll this debt every year. That's why this number is so large. I think when I first started, we were at 5 million or thereabouts. What we're budgeting for in terms of revenue next year is to take out about 4.5 million in debt. And then the other, we should have about 700,000 come in terms of fees. That includes things like rents, leases, those other things. But that 4.5 million, we will use that money to pay off last year's note. Last year's note cost us 4.735 plus interest. So when we get over, so the 4.735 plus interest, 290,000 in interest is $5 million is what it's going to cost us to pay off last year's note, but we're only going to bring in 4.5. And then next year we'll have to pay probably about 6% interest on 4.5. So it's not the most ideal way of maintaining the buildings going forward, which again is why we have that structural challenge that I talked about. The other thing that rounds out our ability to repay that note is this transfer, which comes in from the general fund of about $600,000. So when you add all of these things up together, this is showing a deficit, meaning that we will, as we continue to finalize and refine these numbers, the Right Point Fund may end the year with a small fund balance. Our goal would be basically to have this all zero out. So in the budget appropriations ordinance, we're going to appropriate enough to pay everything off and end with a zero balance in the fund, and we'll continue to work this problem.
But that does not include if anything would happen to the buildings where the additional funding. So if you need something and it's 250,000, then we're adding 250,000 to hopefully your zero.
So my question is why are we continually year after year doing this? This is,
Yeah,
we're losing
We,
money every single year.
Yep.
We will never pay these buildings off. It's a money trap.
Yep.
It's the dumbest thing we do. This has got to get fixed.
no, you're 100% correct. And actually, what we are likely to do is have a work session about that. If not in December, then in January. I have 4 plans for how we kind of move past this. Several of them are already in motion. So,
And no offense, we talked about this last year.
Mhm.
I'm personally done talking about it. I want to see some action done on this.
Yeah.
I would think there's a better way to finance it.
Either finance it or
Correct.
get rid of them.
Yep, we did
Well,
ask.
If you
about
don't
that.
get rid of them, there's
Yeah.
got to be a better way to
Yep.
finance.
And just
Yep.
a little bit more brevity here. How much equity do we have in these buildings?
Not a lot.
None.
0, right? Probably.
I wouldn't say that, but it depends on how you look at it.
And then in the number up on the yellow line, that's 38,000
Mhm.
in deficit. But Right Point is an enterprise fund. Enterprise funds in their
It is
conception.
not. It is a
It's not.
special
It's
revenue.
a special
fund.
revenue fund.
Yep. It does
Okay.
not have to
But
make its
in
money.
all actuality, how much money are we losing a year on these buildings?
I mean, I think you could make an argument that if the amount of subsidy is $600,000, whatever we would need to pay for rent here, which is probably two and a quarter, something like that. It's $400,000 or so. I mean, back of the napkin
It's almost
math.
$500,000 a year.
Mhm.
So
Now, I will say that that has been worse this year. It will be this year and next year because of interest rates.
Interest rates,
We,
yeah.
we got away with this for a very long time because before we had the new income tax, we didn't have the cash flow to issue 30-year bonds. And then after the income tax, we have the cash flow now to issue bonds. But if we do it, we're going to lock in at 6%, which is a real ugly number. So we've been kind of had our hands tied before and now after.
And
But-
that's praying all the holy that
No.
nothing, the air doesn't break, the heat, I mean.
Right. But
Elevate.
what I will do, so and again, we're all on the same page. This is not a pretty picture. And that's why we'll have another conversation here in a month or two, because there are a number of grants that we can chase to try to do roof and other improvements, just to kind of help keep the lights on, keep the costs down. And then in the meantime, like I said, I mean, we've been developing an approach here that we'll be able to run with early next year. So,
the big picture is, a reason why I said enterprise fund, we are landlords. We should make money off of
We
investment.
shouldn't be
property.
landlords.
Yeah, the
That's
city
correct.
couldn't be a landlord.
City of Cincinnati just sold their railroads because they realized they're city, not a railroad company, right? We're not real estate agents.
mhm.
And if you can paint this with 2 pictures, we're supposed to make money off these buildings and we haven't. And so if we're a business, we're running every year $600,000 in the red. The other picture is we're paying $600,000 to have City Hall. And is that how much a year we should be paying for city operate, to have a building for administrative staff?
Right.
I
And
think the hardest part you have with this in general is you can't make a budget on it every year because it consistently changes. You never know. Where if we were just, and we've had this conversation before, we're just paying rent, we know every year we're
Mhm.
paying 2.2, whatever. Or 225,000. And so then you can budget something when we've got a building all over the place. There's just like now with interest rates. I mean, it's constantly changing for us.
So the other thing that I'll just quickly leave on is the other reason that we haven't cut loose and dealt with this already is that if we are not bringing in 4.5 million in a bond note, we have to come up with that money. So if we were to sell the buildings and we were not able to capture $4.5 million or whatever the balance is, we're on the hook for the balance. And our fund balance last year definitely could not have taken it. And if we were to try to do that this year, we would also not be able to do that based on the amount of subsidy that we have to do in other funds and other places. So again, it has been and will continue to be a very sticky issue, but we are working it, and I'll have a work session to kind of dive into it.
The
coming
other
up.
part of this is that even if we sell it and we get a crappy landlord and everybody moves out, we lose all the income tax from all the people that do work here. And that was the main reason that we even considered buying these buildings in the first place, was to keep that from happening. So it's not all necessarily show up in the numbers. Now, the other part of that is the story we were given is they would be self-sufficient, and that has not
But
shown to be true.
I would be warned to say the income tax that we're earning, we're losing every year.
Well, no,
Anyways.
and I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that was when we made the decision to buy the buildings,
Mhm.
it was because we were losing that tax
Mhm.
revenue very quickly because the company that owned the buildings was not doing their due diligence to keep
Mhm.
those people in here.
Well, not only that, I wasn't on council at that time, but the buildings were deteriorating
Mhm.
and becoming a major eyesore. And
Well, I just think that those are the kind of things moving forward, when you look at these type of big decisions, and it doesn't mean you can't make the decision to purchase or whatever. But someone has to be smart enough to look at what the third order effect looks like.
Right, no,
And, you know, I've always said, you know, sometimes you just don't have the tools or the understanding, not just you, but you may be even people, you know, that were giving advice.
We trusted the people
Yep,
that gave us
and-
the
and-
information
And all you can do is now, okay, we have the issue, now we work forward and make it
Right.
better.
no, and I agree with that.
Well, and we are, like I said, you know, we will continue to talk about it. I have many ideas. And that's a conversation that I'm actually looking forward to, because some of the conversations that I've been having, I have some optimism about maybe some directions we can go. So it is a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that's solvable.
And you love challenges,
Oh,
Josh.
yeah, I know. That's why I'm here.
Every day.
well, and part of the problem too is that the neighborhood is. We have taken steps to improve the looks of the neighborhood. A lot of people didn't like to work here because they didn't like the looks of the neighborhood.
Mhm. That's true.
So, you know, the street, and we've done a lot of things that the environment looks much better than it did 3 years ago.
Right. And I think we'll continue that for sure as well. So just to quickly get to the other funds here. So the fire fund is what we're looking at here. This is 2201 is the fund number, but again, one of the things that we're building toward is being able to try to show you what the all-in costs on a department basis are. These pictures are getting closer to that. I think we're going to be at a place where ideally next year, definitely by the year after, we will be where I want to be in terms of being able to show you what the real all-in costs for all of these departments are for capital, debt, operating, et cetera. But again, in the fire fund, you know, the department right now, it brings in about 4.5 million, or that's the revenues, I should say. The expenditures we have also at about 4.5. So we're showing a small deficit here. The important takeaway here is that, and I'll actually give Chief Miller a huge shout out. He's been super proactive with the battalion chiefs and the rest of the department about budget process. What does this budget look like? What do these numbers mean? Sat down, gone through all the line items. He's done a fantastic job of just finding, I think, available budget that can be reallocated in ways that would be more productive, and using that to inform this budget and this budget request. The main takeaway really is, again, even with the income tax and the income tax split. So you'll see here in, oh yeah, it's a transfer. I'm sorry. I always forget that. Even with the transfer in of about 2.8 million in the police fire income tax fund, we will still need a subsidy of about 230,000 from the general fund in order to round out this department's costs for next year. So put a pin in that
And that's
230.
not included with the labor cost.
Yeah, this is before we've negotiated any kind of contract increase with
No,
the,
but this already has labor costs, sir.
It
Just not the, it's got labor costs.
For,
It's
you just
not-
mean regular personnel costs?
Yeah,
Yes, yeah, sorry, those are in there.
I thought you
But-
said that we didn't know,
We don't know where it'll land.
so
Right.
The
we're
increase.
estimating maybe 230,000 of supplement.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before negotiations finalized.
Yes, and that really is kind of the overall approach to the entire budget, because unlike other years, because we have these negotiations that are ongoing or pending, they're coming up, we're shooting a bit in the dark on where some of that's going to land. So what the budget ordinance is going to give you is our best guess at present date about what this is, what we need to put in the appropriations ordinance. But part of the reason behind regularly doing quarterly supplementals is to revisit this as negotiations wrap up. We can make adjustments that we need to make and keep truing up what our actuals look like too, revenues.
So we're gonna be voting on like an estimated budget without final numbers.
Yeah, in the sense, yes. Well, I mean, in the sense that all budgets are estimates. Yes, it's a budget.
That's why you,
Um,
thing called supplemental.
Right. We're going to give you the best and most accurate numbers that we can give you to vote on, and then we'll continue to adjust those the same way we've been doing all year this year. As we need to refine things, we come back and revisit it.
20 years.
Right. It's the way everybody does it.
Have we paid off all the equipment like the $500,000 fire truck and
Oh, Sarah, what a great question. So,
I mean, because I look at the fire equipment and I'm thinking, we're not even making any plans to replace the overflow.
so the short answer is no, we have not repaid, we have not paid it all off. Those debts are here. And this is another area where, again, this is what's taking us, this is where the legwork in trying to streamline this budget comes from, because before, these have been paid out of different funds in different places at different times in prior years. What we're trying to do is bring them all into one place so that we have a nice concise picture about what does this actually cost, and then, we can plan more effectively for what the department needs from there.
So on that $500,000 fire truck, we still owe 111,000.
Yep. I believe.
I think
Oh.
that one only has,
Yeah,
it
it matures in 2 years, 2025.
I mean, I guess the way to look at it, is you're never not going to have loans for some kind of.
Oh, absolutely. I understand
I
that.
mean, whether it's service department, the police department, the fire department, I mean. These pieces of equipment, for us, yeah, we can drive a car for 10 years, 20 years if we wanted to. These pieces of equipment, the way they get used. You just don't have a long span for them.
But that again is part of the story about why, if somebody may look and say, well, the fire department didn't get a subsidy last year. Well, it did. It just didn't look like this. We were still making those debt service payments for these ambulances. It just went to a different fund.
Right.
So what we're doing now is trying to show it all in one bucket.
Got it.
Fair enough.
So it's the same story when we get into police.
Because we pay every year on police vehicles and on
Yep, we've-
leases, right?
We've consistently had loans for police cruisers. So we still have one for 2020, is it 1 or 3 or 2? Okay. So this $31,000 or $32,000 note or, loan payment is for a cruiser. Actually, that should roll off next year. And that will be it. So that's good news there.
but then we're switching to
Leasing.
Then, yeah.
Leases are ongoing. But the advantage of the lease is that you're basically paying
I got
every year
it.
instead of doing,
I got
lump sum
Well,
one year,
and then
but
once again, you have a number that's always consistent.
yeah.
That's in the capital.
Yeah, so the leases that we are procuring through enterprise are all up in here under this assets line. It's kind of gray, but you can see 75,000 in there. That will cover the 76.
Well, there's three cars that will be leasing for the full year. and
Right.
3 leasing for half a year. The estimate will get them mid-year, so that's 6.
Total.
6 total.
Nice.
I'll reserve my one nerd question for this. Is it an asset since we don't actually own it?
Yeah, because Gatsby
Says
notes that if you have a lease, it's
it's-
an asset, and actually software-based IT is also an asset now.
A good question.
Mhm.
Hmm.
another thing that we're having to untangle and clean up as this whole process unfolds.
For me, it
I'll
sounds.
get another nerd question. That wasn't-
I feel like, because it's, for me,
I
It
think it's
sounds like-
GASB 86 if you want to read it up. Read
yeah,
up on it.
because it sounds like an expense, like it should just be like, because you don't. Like, it's not a tangible
don't
thing
know
that
that.
I can say that like, this is my thing. If you don't pay your invoice for SSI, they'll take it away from you. We don't pay our invoice to Enterprise, will take the car away from us. It's not our car. So
If
that's
you
just,
don't pay your
but-
bank statement on your car, the bank comes and takes
Takes
your
your
car,
car.
even though it's yours.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. That's just a weird Gatsby thing.
Yeah, we will continue to untangle that. The issue that I want to point your attention to, though, in police, or not the issue, but just the fact of the matter, is that one of the conversations that we have to have later this year and going into next year is the police property tax levy that rolls off. That we're budgeting what we basically budgeted, or what we made this year, collected this year on the property tax. So that's around $1 million, which is about 20% of this overall budget. If we were to lose that, that would cripple this operation. I mean, we would either have to come out of pocket in the general fund, and to a much greater degree than we are already, or we would be looking at very substantive changes to either this department or another department to cover that cost. So it's not something that we can really afford to lose. On the other hand, we are budgeting, again, the 30% share of the income tax number for next year. That's already in here. But even with all of that revenue, the police department needs almost $1 million from the general fund to mostly solvent. So again, we were at what, 230 plus the 960. So we're $1 million and change. Well, plus the 600 from Right Point. So you call it 1.6, 1.7. If we go then and turn to streets, again, as we talked about at the top, streets does not get a whole lot of money from anything aside from transfers in from the general fund, which this year we're budgeting at $1.7 million in order to cover what its typical expenditures are. And again, the bulk of these expenditures are related to personnel. Actually, let me scroll over here. It's the same in all departments. Personnel is always the most expensive category. But the personnel costs, and this does include our contractual obligations from what we just negotiated. So those are pretty well fixed. But the bulk of this budget goes to support personnel and operating. And then we have some debt here as well that, again, in prior years was paid for out of other funds, but that we've brought in here this year to make it a little more transparent for facilities, the backhoe, dump trucks, pickup trucks, and other, I think these projects. Do you know, Kim? Sorry. That's true. I should use the software that we bought. Yeah, these are prior loans for other projects related to facilities, like the remodeling at 1791. So then we turn to the general fund. And the bottom line is, after you roll up all of the subsidies that the other funds require, plus any of the surplus money that the general fund had to give, the general fund has to come out of its reserves to the tune of about $1 million, based on what we know today, to keep all the other funds operating at present rates, right? So in other words, another way of saying that is we have $1 million structural deficit in this budget because of all the holes that we've been talking about. The revenue picture here again includes kind of that new the revised income tax assumption that we've been talking about. But down here under, I want to go to expenditures and then to transfers. You can see this is where we're accounting for sending all of that money to all of the other funds in order to keep them afloat. And the other thing I'll add just very quickly is that inside the general fund, all of the personnel services lines that you see here reflect the staffing assumptions that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So this is still admin being down 1.6 FTEs because I've eliminated some of those positions. It assumes that we're going to hire a zoning administrator and that we keep an intern in community development. But for the most part, the staffing picture here stays status quo. And again, this is an area where I expect by the time we have this conversation next week, this number is only going to get bigger because we haven't talked about capital assets yet. So our job over the next week is to figure out in the other funds like state highway, permissive tax, ARP, how are we going to take those resources and deploy them to capital projects? And if we have any extra needs after that, they will have to come out of the general fund. And that's the number that we're going to quantify next week. But as far as the operating piece of this goes, I think this is not that it's the most important, but it's the number that I think best describes the structural side of this. Because these are what we're looking at here today are the operating costs, just putting people on the streets, on patrol, running calls, doing permits, typing minutes. This is what it costs just to keep the city moving every day before we've touched loans or not equipment loans, but capital improvement loans, other infrastructure stuff. Any questions before I pivot again?
Where are we at in reserves?
You're ahead of me. Going there next. All right, so asterisk this chart because it will be much more refined next week. But what I'm trying to show here is of the 5 funds that we've just talked about, here is where we expect to end the year in terms of fund balances. So one of the reasons you'll recall in this year's budget, actually, we had projected something very similar where the general fund would have to come out and spend out of its reserves in order to balance the year. We've actually been able to add fund balance in the general fund, mostly because we've run a ton of vacancies and have not had to pay people. That's not sustainable. We can't build the budget, with those holding those vacancies open permanently and continue to maintain our service levels. But the bottom line is that has afforded us a bit of an extra cushion, which is good news because if we take the current general fund balance, if we end up right around 5 million, could be a little more, could be a little less. But we take what the general fund will then have to come out of pocket and pay, which is about, this shows 1,060,000. I think the prior ClearGov estimate was about 996. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in here. But the main idea is that we can absorb that cost. We can absorb about $1 million out of the general fund in order to make this budget go next year. It also assumes that we're not going to dip in super hard to any fund balances that we've put into these other departments. So fire service and police are likely to end the year in some pretty good spots. But Sarah, to your earlier point, if we want to go buy a fire truck, you can kiss that $1 million goodbye and we'll need another 500,000 on top of it. So there's a reason why I've kind of set it up, or we've set it up so that we're trying to preserve some cushions so that when big capital expenses come up, it reduces, we could debt finance it if we wanted to. But if we needed to come out of pocket and make an expense, we could also do that with some reasonable cushion. And it's the same story then in police and service as well. And in Right Point, again, the story here is we'll revisit that for another conversation later. But the main idea is that the goal is just to keep that fund balance as close to $0 as possible, to keep the transfers down as low as possible until we're able to deal with that problem entirely.
And for educational purposes, what are we required by state law to have percentage?
2 months of expenditures, operating expenses. Or there's a couple of criteria too, but
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
can you use that microphone? Yeah.
We do have a contingency fund that has a small balance in it as well. We're just not talking about it today, but it's sitting stagnant right now.
It's in about 300,000.
Yeah, 331.
I think and again, just going off of pure memory and in talking with the Citizens Budget Committee, my recollection is that we would need, in order to maintain that 2-month mark, I believe the number was close to $1 million, or it was between 600,000 and $1 million. I will revisit that though and come back to you next week with a more accurate number. The bottom line though is we're maintaining fund balances that are well above our required minimums for the auditor. Having said that, we can't continue to do this forever. Or we'll be spent right through all of our reserves and still have all these problems.
So we keep this up for just a second.
Mhm.
And this is where I get heart palpitation. is that I look at what the situation would have been if the police and fire income tax wouldn't have passed. I look at our streets not having a dedicated source of funding and that kind of relating to the amount of services we're able to provide. And then also what the situation would be if the police tax levy fails next year.
Doom and gloom.
I mean, it's not, I mean, it's reality.
I understand.
It's not doom and gloom. I mean, I feel like that's part of the systemic issue here is that we haven't had the doom and gloom conversations for a very long time. And the grim reality of it all is that number, these numbers here with the 24 fiscal impact of $1 million taking out a surplus, we can't continue to go on like that. And then if we lose the police levy, like what does the city do? We have 3 purposes or 4: police, fire, streets, and administrative services. We are dangerously close to not being able to do any of those. Or at the levels that we have funding for it, what level of services are we providing? Like, I just want to make sure that the public, everyone's aware of like what the actual situation is, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some pretty clear headwinds, that we face as a community. Having said that, I think we have, like I said, Right Point is its own conversation, but you're actually, once again, here's that kind of teeing up my next slide. Because part of this equation is as this stuff continues to come into focus and we're able to understand and talk about it, more articulate or in a more articulate way. I think that helps inform this conversation. The next thing is kind of like what I alluded to at the beginning. When I mentioned that next year we will have to have some difficult conversations and make some tough decisions, that's kind of what I'm talking about, where, if the levy situation for the police department is pretty critical to keeping that department operational. Having to have a couple work sessions about these buildings, I'm getting ready to go dive headlong into that. Setting a stormwater utility fee rate and trying to project out, revenue and get our utility billing system up to speed so that we can budget for revenues in 2025 and be able to offset some of these costs. Critical conversation. Because the extent to which we make these decisions, or the extent to which you as the council decide when and how to approach some of this, will impact what numbers we can carry into next year's budget as far as being able to offset general fund subsidies that go out, to other funds and other departments. So all that is to say, I think where we are landing on this from a staff perspective is one of the key strategic priorities that you all outlined in the strategic plan was fiscal sustainability. And to me, that's pretty critical because without that, we don't get anything else done. 2024 will be the year where we make decisions that have a direct impact on our fiscal sustainability. And that will be what a lot of our conversations will deal with in work sessions and what a lot of our work behind the scenes will deal with in order to be prepared to move forward on some of these questions so that when we get to 2025, we're hopefully having a much more pleasant conversation about where the budget's at and what our ability to move ahead of the curve in 26 and 27 looks like, rather than keep trying to play catch up.
And I still think we're missing one more piece on here, which is eventually going to be that conversation of a road levy. We're still going to have that conversation at some point as well.
Well, and I thought we were gonna have a conversation about renewal on the police levy by now, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but May's election's been done away with, so now we only have March and maybe not August and November.
March and
It's just March and
March and November. Yep.
Yeah, and so, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we want to go on the March one, we got to get moving.
Council passed a resolution to ask the county for valuations.
Right.
And they're working on that.
Has the resolution.
Yep.
To return.
So we're
planning
We're
to put some in
waiting,
March.
correct, and we're waiting for numbers from the county so that we can revisit
Right.
this.
Well,
Our deadline is the 20th of December.
20th December, of course, our
Right.
meeting's the 21st, but if everything goes to schedule, we'll be hearing this as a resolution on the first meeting in December, which gives us plenty of time.
Okay.
You
Okay.
just pass it as an emergency. There's-
No, we
No.
don't need to. We just, the resolution
Okay.
puts it on the ballot.
Yep.
But that would be answered in March.
It'd be on the ballot.
This is-
the
Right.
primary
Right.
ballot.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, and I have to say,
No
historically,
increase.
that's not been a problem.
Yeah. And they,
Now,
and
the road levy is another issue, but renewals of the police and fire have not historically been issues. Not that we don't have to work for it, but
The good thing is it's a replacement with no increase,
Right.
which
that's what we've been talking about is basically holding the millage, holding the term, but doing it as a replacement.
right,
Replacement
rather than renewal.
right.
Replacement won't go away.
And
Well, I
I,
think it's, isn't the wording some of that
Yes.
too, to fix all that,
Mhm.
why we're talking about a replacement, correct?
Right.
Versus a renewal?
when you mention the wording, is it because it says what, like police,
Well,
EMS
yeah,
or
'cause
something
that
on the
was, I
ballot?
mean, that was before I got here, but I knew that.
Yeah, we
that
did
was
a
a-
little homework on all that.
Okay.
That's largely a function of the way the state law is written. That's what the state law calls it. It does go entirely to police. But yeah, I mean, it really, that boils down to just that, I
But that
think-
would not be collectible until 25.
correct. We get one more year of,
Huh?
But we still have a year.
Yeah, there won't be a
Right.
gap.
right.
There won't be a gap.
If the voters pass it next year, we won't have a gap in funding.
The hard conversations are we need to get something with these buildings. We need a way of funding our streets and public works department. And I mean, that still leaves us in a place where like the general fund is still supplementing public safety, even though we have a 1% or like they get 60% of our income tax. That we're still supplementing them,
We
so
have
they're
1.5%.
not self-sufficient. So, I mean, Josh is right. I mean, there's some very tough decisions that like you have been painted on the wall for a very long time. That these decisions have needed to be made about being able to continue to operate as a city and have money to do so.
this needs to be a year of decisions. I'm tired of talking about it. I'm sitting here 3 years and we've talked about these buildings for 3 years. I'm done. We've got to make a decision. We have to make a decision on it. I mean,
No,
Well,
I'll get
it's-
you
the thing
something.
is, yeah, you just won't keep talking about it. The only thing I'd like to add to this is, and Josh had kind of spoke to it in the beginning, is one of the things too that our city and of course all cities in the state of Ohio, you really need to pay attention to what is happening at your state level
Absolutely.
legislation. You know, this, to me, this doesn't even come down to personal policies. It comes down to how the state, it seems every time you get 1 foot forward, the state removes even more money. And when the state removes more money, that one step forward now goes to compensate for that whole. And so please, when you are looking in your elections and stuff like that, pay attention to these legislators and who are pushing certain things. They're not all pushing it, but there are legislators up there pushing it. And I just can't speak to it hard enough that affects everything we do in this city. And this state has made it where all states don't run this way, but they've made it where the only way for us to get additional revenue is constantly going back to the people. The state lowers your taxes and they collect less. So then that's less money coming to us. It all plays into the one piece. It's kind of like when Josh in the beginning talked about when you pull one thing out of the budget, it affects everything else. So when your state does it, it affects every city in this state. It all trickles back down to us and we're all back in the same boat we were when we started the conversation. So I just can't stress it enough. You really have to pay attention to some of the laws. OML is a great place. You can always read what they're looking at doing. And I will say with the PERS and the retirement fund, they get that passed. That's going to be a hard one, not just for us, but for many cities in the state. So that's all I got to say about it.
So we, again, will continue to work toward getting what I'm going to ask you to adopt this year as far as the budget goes is pretty much what you've adopted in prior years. So it'll be a budget ordinance that lists the funds and the appropriations at a category level, personnel and all other expenses. That will be the budget that we ask you to adopt and that we send off to the county and the state. We will continue to work on the digital budget book that we will flesh out and finalize, and it'll be a much prettier version of the one that I produced next year. As long as once you've adopted the appropriations ordinance, it's just a formality as far as getting the narratives written and all the numbers updated, and then we can produce a nice, pretty budget book. My intention is next year, I believe we'll be at a place where we will be able to start internally this process in ClearGov probably in September or early October at the latest, and actually have a much more engaging conversation internally, but also I'll ask you to just adopt the whole budget book up front, along with the ordinance as well. So again, we continue to build, and I think we're making progress. I actually, I feel pretty good about where things are. They could certainly be worse. And I think we have the voters to thank for that, because without the income tax, we would not be having this conversation. That's for sure. It would be much more bleak.
Yeah,
So,
we used to start the budget process in August and September.
right.
Well, and I think too, with the changeover and everything, and then the change of the system. And, with Kim coming on, I mean, all of this, once again, it's kind of like what he came into, right in the middle of budget talks. So I believe that by next year, that is gonna be a conversation. It's gonna start a whole lot earlier.
You'll come back and check on us.
Now I'm just gonna watch the meetings, and I'm gonna text Josh during the meeting saying,
Oh, I can't wait. Go ahead and put that on.
like, what?
But anyway, I appreciate your time this evening. That's all I had. I did just have two very quick updates, which is that city offices are closed tomorrow in observance of Veterans Day. And a thank you to all the veterans out there who have served. And the second thing is that I believe next week on the 15th, ODOT is going to close Woodman near the bridge. Many of you will recall, or many members of the public may recall, I think there was an incident, we had an unfortunate accident out there earlier in the year when they were working on the beams and beam replacement. I think out of an abundance of caution, ODOT is going to actually close Woodman because they're getting ready to do beams on the other side of the bridge now. So they're going to close Woodman north-south. I believe it's overnight from
I think
10
it's
p.m.
two overnight.
Yeah,
so-
Right, there's a
nights.
couple of them. So that hopefully that'll keep some of the disruption to a minimum. But just the general word that I've been trying to tell people for the last 18 months or
Those
years,
routes.
right, is if you can find an alternate route, just try to avoid the whole
But
area.
I will say
But-
though, now during like 4:30, you do see a lot of different traffic coming down Burkhardt, or how people are
Oh,
traveling.
Yep.
or
I mean, people are
spinning.
figuring it out, like, we're getting to spinning, we're staying away from Woodman, so, I mean, drivers will adjust.
And the
That's-
sign on the bridge is up going west.
Mhm.
Yep.
Looks good. But that's all I have.
All right.
Okay, motion to adjourn.
No.
Oh, no, you
We
want
got
comments?
canceled
Okay,
comments.
comments. Okay.
We'll start.
Couple things I know everybody else say, hometown holidays this weekend.
Right.
I know my
3 to 7.
yes, my sixth grade football team will be having a bake sale there, so be fun. And then this is my last meeting with April, because we have a football tournament to go to next week, so I won't be here next week. So good luck in Wisconsin. Enjoy your cheese curds. It's been great sitting next to me,
Oh,
next to me.
cheese
That's kind of sitting next to you. So I'll miss you. So,
Thank you,
yeah.
thank you.
Is this your last? one, or you got one more?
I'll be here.
Yeah. It won't be as good because I won't be here next week. So
You won't be.
You have any comments?
Oh, I have none. I have
I've
none,
your piece?
and we don't have, well, I do notice someone put a tissue box in front of my thing. I have nothing.
My thing, Josh, Miss Baker, thank you
yeah.
so much for that. I know that I feel like the 2 years I've been here and what I've witnessed in the past, and y'all can testify to this too, but it's not always a pretty picture that you're painting. But what we've seen here was factual. And I can't express enough how grateful I am for the level of detail, the thoughtfulness and the effort that you all put into this over the last year. These types of things aren't easy to do. They take up a lot of resources and time, from a municipality's perspective. So, we're on the tail end of that, and we can see what y'all have been working on over the last year, and the dedication and effort is definitely noticed, and I appreciate all of your work and effort that you've been putting into all this.
Thank you. And I'll give a big shout out to Kim because she's jumped in with both feet and two hands to really take the thing by its horns and try to figure it out with me. So I can't do it alone.
Well, I'm proud of her emptying that office.
Well, that's a work in progress,
And
right?
doing this, Tom, but he was dedicated for a long, long time.
Yes.
I have nothing other than Santa arrives at 3 o'clock. So if you want to bring your children out to greet Santa, you need to be there at 3 o'clock.
And it's at
Stebbins High
7.
School.
Grandchildren.
Stebbins High School.
I have nothing.
Nothing.
Remember, flags
I
are
know.
going up this week. For Veterans Day. It's the last time they'll be up for this year, and then we'll do it again next year. Don't forget, we are going to try to put a star on top of the tree at Stebbins tomorrow. Hopefully I can figure out a way to make that attach on top.
I saw the pre-run and it looked nice.
Josh and Kim, thank you very much.
Mhm.
I've been doing this a lot of years and I actually can understand it now. This time, it was always crazy before and I just kind of went through the motions and didn't worry about it and trusted it, but I trust you guys more than I've trusted others in the past. So thank you very much for all your effort. And I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And the rest of staff too. I'm sure all the other people are
I think the
pushing.
clerk will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Adjourn. Yeah, motion is adjourned.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.